the 19th of June, 1944, 0217 hours, a combat information center deep inside a fast carrier of Task Force 58. The room breathes with machines. The air tastes like dust warmed by tubes, like paint and coffee, and a little ozone from the racks that hum against the bulkheads. A young radarman leans in, eyes narrowed to a horizontal slit by the glow that lives inside the hood of his scope. The trace runs left to right like a heartbeat. It is mostly a smooth plateau of nothing, punctuated by minor static and the occasional friendly echo that the system has already been taught to forgive. On the 40-mile ring there's a flower of sea clutter that pulses like rain. Beyond 100 the line is clean, and then just once it rises and falls so slightly he might have dreamed it. He waits one full rotation of the antenna, counting off 4 seconds in a mind-made metronome by training and repetition, and the tooth rises again. A second weak spike shoulders up beside it, as though encouraged to grow by the faith of the first. He presses his talk switch and says, in a voice that is careful not to sound young, "Sick. Air search. We have a contact. Bearing 310. Range 200. His finger holds the switch just long enough for the room to hear itself change. In that darkness, beneath the blue-lamped plot, 2 plotters straighten at once. Grease pencils lift like bayonets, then whisper as they drop their waxy marks onto the C-labeled plastic that covers the master chart. A line is a story. 2 points make a sentence. 3 points become a plan. The watch officer steps closer. He doesn't bark. He doesn't need to. The men around him have done the drill often enough that the ritual occurs at the level of muscle memory. Someone flips a transparent tag from skunk, the category for uncertainty, to bogey, the label that means aircraft and intent. The controller, whose voice is a blade of calm, calls the first bearing over the circuit, and then waits, like a conductor, with a baton raised, for the second sweep to confirm what the first one promised. The sweep comes, and the baton drops. Raid 1, bearing 310, range 200, Angels High. Recommend cap launch, vector to follow. On the hangar deck, this calm becomes movement. The ship feels the order like a twitch in a nerve. Plane captains slap fuselages with the affectionate violence of men who love and distrust their machines. Hellcats are pulled into position with wingtips that seem too big for the aisles and yet, by practice, fit through them like a trick. Air is pulled in by prop arcs and thrown back as a wind that smells of leaded gas and rope and salt that has dried inside cuffs. Elevators rise. Blast deflectors climb. The flight deck crew speaks a language of gestures refined down to a single finger, dropped at the right instant, and a wrench set aside with quiet care so it never skitters across non-skid. Up on the island, the flag bridge draws its own breath. The Admiral's staff looks down at the transparent plotting table, where the grease pencil geometry turns each new sweep into a stronger line. The sea is a black sheet under stars. The ship's wake writes its signature. The bogey is still a ghost that only exists in a room without windows, but that ghost has already modified the ship's minutes, and minutes are more precious than shells. The Japanese pilots who are now somewhere behind that echo, noses pointed toward the Marianas, do not yet know they've been found. They are trained for their own kind of night in which weather is a mask and courage is a solvent. For them, surprise is a matter of ribboning in low under cloud, of exploiting gaps in patrol lines that, in their staff tables, must be thin because the ocean is large and the defenders are few. For the Americans, surprise is a property of time and loops. Surprise is the fact that your mission timeline is being countered before you even confirm the silhouette of your target. Surprise is a voice that says, Green 12, Vector 0, Niner 0, Angels 2 to 3 Buster, and turns what felt like open sea into a hallway with an American on either end. The second contact strengthens. The range barely changes because 200 miles is a large number that shrinks slowly when you are flying 250 knots against it, but the bearing holds steady, and the Angels call firms up into a band that sounds like an altitude instead of a rumor. The controller makes the voice calm on purpose, because a calm voice is a force multiplier. He is young enough to be frightened by his power, but disciplined enough to hide it inside his syntax. He speaks numbers because numbers travel cleanly along wire. He speaks in a meter that tells the flight deck exactly how many minutes are left to solve. He keeps to nouns that are roles, not names. Bogey, raid, cap, picket, director. The men on the deck move faster not because he said hurry, but because the arithmetic implied urgency. A plane captain with oil ground into his cuticles stares past a prop as the first fighter tears free of inertia and rolls for the bow. The ship's headwind takes the breath from his throat and throws it behind him. The pilot is a silhouette inside a canopy, name chalked on the cowling by a hand that won't be remembered but is essential. The Hellcat leaps in that way naval fighters do when the deck and the wind and the throttle all agree. It becomes a streak against a night that is starting, in everyone's mind, to brighten with what it soon will hold. Contrails like chalk slashes that intersect where men's lives end, and tracers that seem to write their own names across the air, even though they are, in fact, anonymous. 2 more fighters follow, then 2 more. The flight director's palm flattens as he walks them forward on the deck edge, with gestures that must be correct, because they cannot be loud. The ship has already altered course to put a little more wind down the deck, a little more lift into the wings that are still eating through their climb deficit, to the altitude where the bogey will cross. Below, the radar antenna turns. Every 4 seconds is a page in a book being written as quickly as it is read. The line thickens. The Japanese formation holds a course that looks, on the plot, like confidence. No one in that formation understands that 200 miles is not only distance, it is the Americans' first harvest of time. A carrier's crew can purchase 7 minutes of climb for a fighter if they know early enough to light the engine. A destroyer picket can move a few watts of attention toward a bearing if it is asked in time. A fire control director can be spun to the proper quadrant, so its first look is already correct when the leakers arrive. Each new sweep is a transfer of value from attackers to defenders, a tax on surprise that compounds interest in favor of the man in the dark room who holds the grease pencil. By 0226, the plot looks like an intention. The controller assigns green 12 to the intercept and holds blue 6 in reserve to ladder the approach should the raid split or drop altitude. The captain glances once at the admiral's face and sees nothing but intent. The ticks along the edge of the transparent board, each a minute, feel larger than they did 10 minutes ago. Somewhere the cooks are on their second pot. Somewhere a machinist mates an ammunition cradle to a hoist and feels the click that means continuity. The wall is already there, even though no one could point to it on a map. It is assembled from pulses and habits, built from a mesh of circuits and doctrines, and its bricks are function and speech. At 0232, the voice says, "Raid 1 now, 19er 4 miles. No change in bearing. Angels 2 to 4 to 2 to 6. Course steady." The words are unadorned because drama is the enemy of precision. But the words are also an oath. We can see you, and on that oath hangs the next hour of a battle that will later be called a shoot. The paint is still clean on 1,000 rivet heads. The sun is hours away. The enemy is out beyond where a man's eyes quit. And yet the fleet is already moving to meet him as if distance had always been an illusion. That is the gift the radarman's faint tooth made. That is the moment the night bent to the loop. The heart of the matter is not mysterious, but its simplicity is disguised by the fact that it was achieved with so many parts and so much discipline. The United States Navy built an invisible wall 200 miles from its carriers, and that wall was made of time. It was constructed from the conversion of radio pulses into minutes, minutes into altitude, altitude into geometry, and geometry into kills that, when tallied across a campaign, do not look like luck or even audacity. They look like inevitability. The Japanese airplanners never wrote this wall into their math. They designed missions around transit times across blue gaps, around hoped-for patrol densities that would be thin at dawn and thinner after dark, around the presumption that if they launched far enough and timed it aggressively enough, they could arrive intact, unleash surprise, and leave before the defenders' circuits could think a thought. What they met, instead, was a decision cycle already in motion while they were still 200 miles out. They were late to their own surprise. To call it a wall is not merely metaphor. It behaved like a boundary that transformed what passed through it. Outside the wall, the Japanese formation possessed intention and speed and cohesion. Inside the wall, each one of those qualities began to erode. Intentions solidified into a predictable straight line that a controller could attack with trigonometry. Speed became an input into interception timing that narrowed rather than widened their options. Cohesion broke when the first section of American fighters arrived at high altitude, already vectored onto the bearing the radar had been singing for minutes, and forced either a defensive break or a climb that cost fuel they had planned to spend above the target. A force that expected to be a spear found itself dissolving into scattered droplets before it could pierce anything solid. A wall does this to a body. It splinters and redirects. The machinery that enabled the wall did not, by itself, guarantee victory. The cavities inside magnetrons wear their moods. Vacuum tubes warm slowly and fail without apology. Sea clutter fakes returns. Atmospheric ducting bends energy in ways that can either grant vision farther than a manual suggests or hide a raid that should have stood out like a bailer light. Operators get tired. But what doctrine can do is not subtract these failures, but overwhelm them. The Navy did not rely on a single set or a single operator. It layered air search with height finding, and then fused that picture with the eyes of picket destroyers that extended the network's horizon, the way a man standing on a chair can peer over the crowd. It drilled radarmen to doubt their first echo but to mark their second, to never bet the fleet on a ghost, and to marry skepticism to method. It trained controllers to speak in syntax that coheres under stress, not to appeal to heroism on the air, but to act as if a calm set of numbers could unscare the sky. The wall was not a gadget. It was a culture. On the other side of this culture sat a doctrine that had earned its romance honestly in earlier years. Japanese aviators trained hard, flew with a freedom that frightened opponents who had not previously met men willing to ride risk so closely, and built reputations in the crucible of China and the early Pacific campaigns that seemed to prove a thesis about the supremacy of nerve and maneuver. But a thesis that worked when the opponent's detection range was human eye and chance patrol becomes brittle when the opponent's detection range is a sweep that never blinks, that never sleeps, that trains the fleet's attention miles ahead of where its gun directors can see. The tragedy is that courage is not depreciated by the wall, it is made obsolete by it. A pilot can decide to be brave inside a geometry that has already closed on him. His bravery can save a wingman or delay a kill by a minute. It cannot undo the arithmetic by which he was seen earlier than he thought possible. The wall stands and his courage smashes against it. Consider the way this difference in worldview expresses itself in language. Japanese planning documents emphasize routes and altitudes and surprise windows. They read like the storyboard for a heist. Ingress, action, egress, acceptance of loss. American fighter direction boards, by contrast, read like a scheduler's notebook: sweep interval, track confirmation, vector assignment, cap rotation, AA sector priority. One speaks of an event, the other of a process. Processes can be improved and repeated. Events can only be remembered. That is why the wall grows stronger as a campaign continues. The more nights a controller narrates ranges and angels into a circuit, the more exact his voice becomes. The more times a plotter turns 2 points into a track, the more efficiently she uses the clear square on the board. The more launches the deck executes at night, the smoother the choreography becomes. Industrial time was beating inside procedural time, and together they amounted to an invisible masonry that bent approach after approach until the men inside the raids lost not just aircraft, but confidence in the very idea of surprise. 200 miles is a round number. It sounds like a boast if you chip it into a plaque. In reality, the wall flexed. On some nights, ducting pushed effective range out. On some days, weather folded it back. But the claim matters less than the habit. If the system is built around acting early, then any additional range is violence. If it's built around reacting late, then any loss of range is fatal. Every mile of early warning becomes a minute of climb, a minute of vector refinement, a minute for a destroyer's radar to hand off the track to a carrier's height finder, a minute for a gun crew to select ammo, a minute for the admiral to choose whether to unmask the fleet's position by launching now or by waiting another sweep. Every mile that is not warned is a minute stolen from the defender and gifted to the attacker. The invisible wall did not require perfect omniscience. It required a statistical tilt across many contacts that, when graphed, shows a decisive accumulation of defended minutes. To accuse the Japanese of ignorance is too neat. There were officers who suspected such ranges were possible, who knew from captured fragments and rumor that the Americans had married electronics to doctrine in ways that were not merely embellishments, but transformations. War, however, is a pedagogy of blood. You learn what the other man can do when he does it. By the time the lesson clarifies, the syllabus has moved on. Pilots returning from failed strikes describe a sensation that sounds like betrayal by the air itself. Intercepted far out, taken from above, cut apart before they could even smell the ships they thought they might burn. Surprise did not die theatrically. It died bureaucratically, in rooms without windows where men spoke in bearing lines and angles and changes in rate. The wall is not a monument. It is a schedule that will not move just because you need it to. So write it clean and keep it unforgiving. The United States converted radio pulses into decision time and decision time into layered intercepts that broke raids before those raids could cohere at the point of attack. That conversion erected an invisible wall at ranges up to 200 miles from the fleet. The Japanese did not incorporate such a wall into their mission math. That omission fed their courage to an equation that had no place for it. And once a war begins to be decided by equations, the side that treats time as a manufacturable commodity beats the side that treats it as a backdrop. The rest of this story is simply how the wall worked in practice, and what it did to men who flew into it believing the ocean was empty, when the ocean was in fact a clock that belonged to someone else. Start with the sweep, because that is where the world changes. The antenna turns with a steadiness that would be hypnotic if the men around it were not at work. Each revolution is a promise that the sky will be revisited. The transmitter fires a pulse that no one can feel, a concentrated burst that leaves the ship faster than any projectile it carries, crosses the uncolored water, and touches the aluminum skins of aircraft with a pressure too faint to bruise. A whisper of that touch returns. The receiver pulls it up from the noise the way a practiced ear plucks a melody from a crowded room. On the screen, the return is not a picture of an airplane. It is a spike that has learned to represent one. That abstraction is the first miracle. The enemy has been reduced from shape and paint to distance and bearing. From there, the machine hands the problem to people. The plotter's world is a smooth sheet and a pencil that leaves a bright line. She leans over the board with an attitude that looks like prayer, and is, in its way, a kind of devotion. At the sound of the first bearing, she marks a point at the correct range, circle, and angle. At the second sweep, she marks another, and the ruler turns those points into a line that is not a guess but an inference. She writes a time hash next to the point as if signing a receipt for reality. The watch officer glances and sees not just 2 points but a course and speed. He has done this often enough that his brain completes the vector faster than his hand can lay the straightedge down. He confirms before he orders, because he has also learned how easily a single echo can trick, and doctrine has taught him that 2 points are a hint and 3 are a truth with consequences. A controller stands with a headset clamped, voice fed to pilots who are orbiting in a cap or taxiing toward a deck edge they trust but never love. His language is an instrument. He says vector and number and angels and buster, and does not embellish because anything extra is a pollutant in the channel. He knows the climb rates by heart, not as lines in a manual but as practical estimates that live in his throat. He knows that a Hellcat, heavy with fuel and ammunition, will climb to 20,000 feet in 7 or 8 minutes if the wind is kind and the pilot does not ham-fist the throttle. He knows that to meet a raid at 80 to 100 miles, he needs to launch at once, because time flown later cannot be flown earlier. His tone is unhurried because he is pulling haste out of the system by placing urgency in the math rather than the voice. The pilots hear him and climb. In their cockpits, the world simplifies to a rising altimeter and a compass that is being corrected every few seconds by the line the controller keeps drawing in the air. The picket destroyers, stationed ahead and around, have their own scopes and their own talkers and a responsibility that feels like standing on the rim of a volcano with a thermometer. They extend the fleet's senses in the most literal way. By being physically closer to the incoming raid than the carriers are, they shift the point at which the first return becomes the second, and the second becomes a track. The handoff between a picket's report and the carrier's air search picture is another kind of miracle, accomplished over circuits that crackle with salt and anxiety. The goal is a merged reality, not a set of competing ones. When the merger is done, the raid is now a single object in the mind of the fleet, a thing with bearing and speed and altitude bands that can be named, updated, and acted upon. The gun directors are awake by now. They are not yet the actors in this play, but they rehearse quietly. Ammunition crews check loads. Sector priorities are confirmed so that the first visual report of leakers can be met not with a scramble for order, but with orders that have already been agreed upon. The fire control radars, shorter ranged but steely precise, will later take single aircraft and draw boxes around them the way a hunter frames a deer in a sight. For the moment, their role is to remember the habits that will matter when the sky becomes busy. Range rate, lead angles, the difference between a diving silhouette that means attack and a climbing tail-on that means escape. Even this rehearsal is a form of the wall. It adds a little height, a little thickness of certainty to the barrier the raid must cross. Inside the cap orbit, the pilots talk less than you might expect, because talking is a tax on attention. They listen for the controller and fly triangles and circles that approximate readiness. The first vector comes as a simple cut. Turn to 090. The second is a fine tune. The third locks the geometry. The pilot, who is a little better at math, feels an anticipatory thrill when he realizes the merge will occur with him above and slightly ahead of the raid, the position from which energy can be spent, like money for a kill. He knows that if he arrives low and behind, he will be paying interest to a fight he does not want. The controller knows this too, and builds an approach like a banker arranges a payment plan. Small adjustments early, fewer big ones later, so that by the time the moment comes, the pilot feels as if the enemy has cooperated with his plan. There are failures here that become lessons. A ghost return that drags a section off to nowhere. A misread altitude that puts the cap 5,000 feet below the raid and forces a climbing intercept that burns time they don't have. A handoff that fails because a circuit is noisy just then and two clocks go out of sync. But systems built for repetition metabolize failure. Though after-action critique is not theatre, it is surgery. Operators are rotated before their eyes dull. Antenna motors are serviced to keep the sweep honest. Controllers practice phraseology until they can speak in numbers while half asleep. Each improvement is a little more mortar between the bricks of the wall, and always these mechanics are wrapped within an industrial rhythm that is not romantic but is decisive. It matters that spare parts are in labeled boxes that arrive on time. It matters that training pipelines filled billets ahead of need, that a radarman who washes out for fatigue is replaced without drama, that the men who fix the sets can do so between swells because the brackets someone designed back in New Jersey hold the thing steady enough for hands to work. The wall is a pulse and a plot and a voice, but it is also the fact that a crate labeled with the right part number found its way to the right deck 6 weeks ago. You cannot see that detail in a scope. You can feel it in the way the sweep keeps returning, the way the controller's confidence is never theatrical, because he knows the machine behind his tone is maintained. When the intercept finally happens, it seems inevitable. The pilots roll in from the altitude the controller bought with early detection. The Japanese formation, which had been a spear, begins to fray into twos and ones. Some turn to meet the threat early and die far from their objective. Some press on and die later, closer, proof that tenacity is not the same thing as success. The few that leak through do so in a shape that no longer resembles a strike plan. Below, the gun directors wake fully. boxes around silhouettes, arithmetic catching up with courage, belting steel into the air with the indifference of machinery working as intended. The wall does not stop every man. It stops enough to make the rest's effort tragic. That is how it works, not as magic but as method, not as a single device but as a schedule of attention in which the earliest minute is the most lethal, and the men who conjure that minute are anonymous in a dark room that smells of coffee and hot dust and victory, distilled into range and bearing. Turn the ocean into arithmetic, and the romance of distance dissolves. 200 miles at 200 knots is an hour. 200 miles at 250 knots is 48 minutes. A raid that accelerates to 300 knots steals 10 minutes and still leaves the defender nearly 40 to play with. These are not marginal differences tucked into footnotes. They are the currency with which a fleet buys altitude, position, redundancy, and calm. Every knot the attacker adds burns, fuel, and narrows options. Every minute the defender gains, multiplies them. The elegant cruelty of radar is that it begins the multiplication earlier than the attacker realizes math has entered the conversation. Start with the simplest exchange: climb rate versus warning time. A fighter that climbs at 2,500 feet per minute and needs to be at 25,000 feet to meet a raid coming in high requires 10 minutes just to achieve the height from which it can fight on even terms. If the defender learns of the raid at 120 miles instead of 200, that fighter's 10 minutes might exist only as theory, because the launch, the crank to military power, the vector to the intercept point, each bites minutes from the budget, and each has some irreducible overhead. At 200 miles, by contrast, you can buy the climb with margin. You can allow the pilot to stage through a stepping orbit that arrives at the merge, with energy to spend rather than a debt to repay. That difference converts into kills in a way that feels unfair only if you believe the sky should forgive poor bookkeeping. Vector geometry obeys a similar law of returns. The earlier you know the bearing and speed of a raid, the smaller the vector changes you need to lay a fighter on top of it. Corrections of 5 degrees made at 150 miles are gentle bends that cost almost nothing in speed. Corrections of 20 degrees made at 70 miles are panic, requiring dives that squander altitude or climbs that arrive late. The controller who can adjust in fine increments creates a path that feels to the pilot like being delivered to the right place by a hand he never sees. The controller who is forced to jerk the vector around at the last minute delivers his man to a fight he doesn't own. Each vector is an investment, and the portfolio that gets attention early compounds more reliably than the portfolio managed from habit and hope. Even the destroyer pickets live inside this economy. A picket stationed 40 miles out effectively drags the wall toward the enemy because its first detection becomes the fleet's second, and because correlation can be done on 2 scopes instead of 1. If the picket set sees a raid at 180, the carrier's set confirms at 176, and what would have been a cautious guess becomes a confident track. In the time it takes for the antenna to turn twice, a bogey becomes a raid and a raid becomes a plan. Those 4 or 8 seconds are nothing on a clock, and decisive in a system where the purpose is not to be omniscient but to be early. The wall is fortified not with high rhetoric but with 4-second increments that never stop arriving. Now look at speed as a governor of choice. Pilots like to imagine that going faster means owning the initiative. It can, if you're dictating terms. But speed is also a promise you make to your own fuel state. At 300 knots, the Japanese raid closes 200 miles in 40 minutes. Every 5 minutes of delay on the defender's side still leaves time to get fighters up. But the shape of the merge changes, the kill zones slide inward, and the AA belts must assume a heavier load of work. At 200 knots, the raid gifts the fleet a full hour of planning, which in war is an absurd generosity. The defenders will not always be granted such a rate. Weather will force the raid higher into thinner air, where true airspeed climbs. Headwinds will lie or help. None of that changes the rule. The calculus of early warning is not see them far, feel good. It is see them far, schedule better. And scheduling is what turns a predicted merge into an arranged massacre. The arithmetic does not stop with fighters. Ammunition decisions consume minutes that radar returns purchase. Certain belts must be broken open, links must be checked, fuses must be set. Even a crew that moves like choreography needs a number of minutes to convert from a relaxed ready to a state of coiled lethality. If the first visual report of a raid is also the first instruction that matters, then you are not firing the first perfect salvo, you are fumbling for it. If the first visual report arrives as a confirmation of what the scopes have been saying for half an hour, then guns are already laid, directors already slewed, and the first salvo belongs to physics rather than narrative. You can hear the difference in the pitch of voices. In the late discovered fight, men shout the names of ammunition types as if the syllables themselves mattered. In the early warned fight, men call ranges and bearings as if they were reading a ledger, because they are. There is also a psychology to minutes that engineers sometimes omit. A cap pilot who launches because a controller says 200 miles lifts with a confident hurry that is distinct from panic. He flies his climb schedule as trained because the geometry supports his patience. He saves his throttle for the merge instead of burning it there. He arrives with a pocket of options because he has not spent them reaching the sky in a blind sprint. The Japanese pilot subjected to early interception experiences the opposite conversion. He understands, somewhere between his stomach and his spine, that he is being met too far from the fleet. He breaks too early or too late. He bleeds energy defending rather than spending it attacking. And the thought that the enemy knew he was coming takes a small but measurable bite out of his willingness to press through fire. That bite enlarges over a campaign until it conscripts whole squadrons. Math, here, becomes morale. At the fleet level, minutes cascade into days. Fewer successful strikes against carriers mean decks that keep flying, which means caps that keep forming, which means more raids are broken earlier, which means fewer leaks reach the AA belts already coiled around the inner ring of ships, which means fewer explosions peel paint inside hangars, which means maintenance cycles keep their rhythm, which means the wall holds with less heroism required each day than the last. The miracle of early warning is not the dramatic interception that journalists love to describe. It is the anti-drama of continuity. It is a ship that keeps her schedule, and an air group that rotates pilots without praying for impossible luck. Numbers buy this quiet. 200 miles is a number that buys it in chunks large enough to matter. None of this suggests that early warning guarantees perfection. There will be nights when a squall line hides a raid that should have been obvious. Days when ducting paints, a phantom that drags fighters off their post and leaves a corner of the fleet exposed. Moments when the voice on the circuit misstates an angel and a section meets a raid 5,000 feet low and has to climb through tracers to correct the mistake. But a system that starts early survives its own errors better than a system that starts late. If the controller's first call was made with 40 minutes in hand, he can afford to be wrong for 5 and still be right in time to save the day. If his first call arrives when the raid is already at 100 miles, 5 minutes of error puts the merge into the ship's lap. The math is merciless in this way. It rewards those who build slack into the schedule and punishes those who rely on stylish execution at the last possible moment. So measure the sky the way the Americans did, not as a volume of opportunity for heroics, but as a ledger of minutes to be allocated with discipline. 200 miles is not a boast. It is a budget line. At that range, the fleet can launch, climb, vector, layer, rehearse, and still hold fighters in reserve in case the raid splits or faints. At that range, the picket can hand off tracks cleanly. The height finder can polish angels into something that probes can trust. The controller can deliver sentences to pilots that sound like certainty rather than hope. At that range, surprise dies of bureaucratic causes. And a war in which surprise keeps dying of paperwork is a war that the side with the better filing cabinet will win. The Japanese never wrote this into their problem set. They flew into a space that looked like ocean and turned out to be time, and time, once claimed, does not give itself back. The Combat Information Center is not a room that reports events, it composes them. That is the secret it shares with an artillery fire direction center. In artillery, Timing converges many tubes on one square so that the target experiences simultaneity. In the fighter direction world, timing and geometry converge many pilots on one invisible coordinate of air so that a raid feels attacked from every altitude at once. The difference between sequence and simultaneity is the difference between a duel and a dismantling. Inside the CIC, the promise is simple and relentless. Maintain the picture. Every sweep must yield a bearing and range reliable enough that the next vector rests on it without wobble. You hear the sweep as a metronome, and after a while, you think in 4-second phrases. With each phrase, authority accumulates. A raid detected near 200 miles grants the controller the right to design the next 40 minutes of the enemy's life. He layers altitude 1 pair high to pounce, 1 mid to break escorts, 1 low to intercept leakers, and he layers time, because fighters are not statues in the sky but moving budgets of fuel, heat, and nerve. Launch too early and you loiter heavy. Launch too late and you arrive climbing through the merge. The controller sketches 3 converge points in his head and chooses one with malice toward the enemy's options. He wants the high section to hit as escorts commit and structure stiffens. He wants the midsection to bite where broken pieces descend because pilots under pressure search thicker air. He wants the low pair to make the sea an accomplice against the clever few who skim for clutter. Vectors are his sentences, and restraint is his style. 5-degree corrections at 100 miles are gentle curves that save energy later. 20-degree corrections at 70 miles are noisy and expensive. He speaks without theatre because theatre taxes attention. The pilots feel the clarity as confidence. Their instruments steady, and the horizon becomes a desk on which they set calculations instead of a cliff they hurl themselves from. Below, the deck breathes in rhythm. Elevators rise, tractors tow, ordnance crews move belts like tailors feeding cloth. Launch, recover, refuel, rearm each, a beat inside a longer sentence the controller keeps writing. If you could diagram the sky when this works, you wouldn't see a furball, you would see a corridor. The first high pair slices from sun into the top of the raid, forcing escorts to break into directions that suit American geometry. 10 miles back, the second high pair arrives not to kill new targets, but to keep killing, because the worst thing for a raid is the sense that the sky has become organized against it. Mid-altitude sections are stationed like nets where stragglers will fall, not where they are. Low pairs guard the floor the way pickets guard the horizon. Every appearance of an American fighter seems prophetic to the men inside the raid, but what they are seeing is simply a schedule made visible. Numbers do not abolish courage, they give it architecture. At closure around 4 miles a minute, a 20-mile mistake is 5 minutes of life squandered. A fighter's climb at roughly 2,500 feet per minute converts warning time into altitude and altitude into options at a rate you can plot with your thumbnail. Voice delay on a saturated circuit is a tax you can feel in your teeth. A clean handoff from picket to carrier is an investment that pays when the high pair arrives 6 miles sooner than a tired controller would have allowed. The system tolerates mess, a pilot's angle misjudged, a radio stepped on because the corridor keeps forming. By the time a few leakers reach the inner ring, gun directors inherit a problem already reduced to fragments. The last moments feel personal to the men behind guns and inside cockpits. The deciding moments were impersonal and occurred when a calm voice believed a faint echo, drew a line, and rationed minutes like a banker. The morning that would be named like a carnival game begins with competence instead of spectacle. Air search sets wake clean. Pickets feed corroboration. The first raid stands up at a range that gives everyone room to be exact. The controller pulls his cap outward along the bearing, 1 pair to 30,000, another to the low 20s, the reserves climbing through the teens on a ladder that keeps their egress clear. The first intercept comes at roughly 90 miles. A year earlier, that would have sounded like bravado. On this day, it sounds like policy. The high section's opening slash is unsentimental. Catch the escort at the edge of its weave, convert altitude into speed, spend exactly enough energy to force a defensive turn, and drag part of the screen down where the mid-pair waits. The object is not isolated kills, it is dissolved structure. The mid-pair chooses the wingman who keeps formation coherent, not the showy turner whose smoke would flatter the retelling. The Japanese leader keeps his heading with professional stubbornness because he knows that hesitation invites a swarm. The controller watches the scope and the clock together and sends his second high pair not to where the fight is, but to where he knows the first contact will leave the raid. 10 miles back, 2,000 feet above, from a sun the enemy can't quite pass because their eyes have adjusted to cloud. Reports stack with the dryness of ledger lines. 1 smoking, 2 dropping out of the top band, 3 attempting to reform. Vectors adjust by single digits, then by none at all, because the geometry has hardened into an inevitability that even the controller hesitates to disturb. At 75 miles, the second slash lands. The escorts lose cohesion, the strike element's profile phrase. A few slip down for the sea, trusting in clutter and bravado, but pickets have been positioned as extensions of the wall, and short-range sets bloom the low men into targets as real as any at altitude. Handoffs are clean. The destroyer's talker farms the contact to the carrier's picture, and the controller subtracts another option from a raid already in debt. Recovery and launch rhythms below are biblical in their repetition. The LSO waves 2 birds aboard. The deck breathes. Tractors pivot. Another section appears on the lift with its nose already pointed like a polite question. There is no dramatics to write about, which is why the day later reads like annihilation engineered by smugness. In truth, it is annihilation engineered by manufacturing and rehearsal. The second wave meets Americans farther out than the first because the first wave taught more than it cost. Altitude bands are adjusted by 1,000 feet. The initial vector is nudged. Reserves are moved early so they arrive without the smell of panic in their climb. The sky fills with the habit of being on time. What most post-war tallies forget is that the slaughter did not depend on pilots becoming superhuman in the hour that made them famous. It depended on a network, working as if it were one object. A plotter who did not smudge a line kept a vector honest. A machinist whose habit was to tighten a fitting a little beyond the minimum kept a magnetron happy for one more sortie. A destroyer captain held his drift off a few yards so his set became the hinge of a handoff. The men who rolled in from the sun were the visible tip of an invisible machine that had started 40 minutes earlier with a faint spike. By 50 miles, the first wave is no longer a wave but a ruin of good intentions. A handful of bombers hold their run out of duty rather than hope, and pay the price to gun directors that have been quietly rehearsing their own geometry for half an hour. Turkey shoot, flatters marksmanship. The day's essence was schedule. Kills were not plucked from chaos. They were harvested at distances that turned luck into a rounding error. The victory feels inevitable when told backward. It was built forward, and it began the moment someone believed the scope and treated 200 miles as time. The doctrine that fails here is not born of stupidity, it is born of memory. Early war triumphs had taught Japanese aviators that a long ocean favors initiative, that human eyes are the reliable scout of last resort. That surprise is the arithmetic of courage plus weather plus practice. In that story, reconnaissance is texture, interception is an encounter near the target, and decisive decisions happen at the sharp end, under the enemy's guns. You fly far, you turn in, you bind a formation with nerve, and you trust that defenders will be late because men always are. When the Americans built a wall of minutes 200 miles out and made a culture that believed its whispers, that story broke. A low-level approach that once counted as cunning became a death sentence when the network included pickets married to the carrier's picture. Radio silence that once preserved the cohesion of strike and escort preserved nothing when detection came not from what you transmitted, but from what you reflected. The pre-briefed route designed to slip between patrol lines meant for eyes dissolved when vectors kept rearranging the sky into corridors you did not plan to enter. Pilots trained to improvise in the last 60 seconds of a run were forced to improvise 40 minutes out, where improvisation is not audacity but entropy. Surprise in their language was theatrical. Appear from nowhere and act. Surprise in American practice was temporal. arrive earlier in the decision loop, and make acting impossible. There was a deeper assumption, spiritual and therefore stubborn, that fairness resides in proximity. Honest fighting is close, where risk is mutual and courage can see itself. Radar and doctrine conspired to move combat away from that intimacy, and the pilots who were intercepted high and far from the target felt not defeat so much as theft. The Americans did not call it unfairness, they called it efficiency. But in a cockpit, efficiency wears the face of a thief. You can hear that shock in later testimonies from men who describe the sky as complicit with the enemy, as if the air itself had chosen sides. What had chosen was a loop, antenna to scope, scope to plot, plot to vector, vector to merge, and back again. Institution compounded the problem. Japanese electronics existed and could bite, but rugged, repeatable sets and the training paths to staff them at scale lagged. Salt, vibration, and the monotony of long watches break attention and hardware alike, and the American answer to both was redundancy. If a set sulked, another covered. If an operator's eye dulled, rotation saved him from believing a ghost. Doctrine yoked the parts. Standardized phraseology, a hierarchy of action that put keeping the picture above chasing glamour, an after-action culture that punished excuses and rewarded corrections. The Japanese adjusted toward the memory of what had once worked. The Americans adjusted toward the mean of what instruments kept saying would usually happen. When war turns statistical, the side that trusts trend lines will break the side that trusts anecdotes. This is not a story without American error. There were days the wall sagged, ducting painted whales, handoffs failed, fatigue turned, a calm voice thin, raids got through in lumps and made the inner ring pay. Those lumps did not convert into doctrine, because the correction vector always pointed back to early warning and schedule. The Japanese corrections pointed back to nerve, to better closing speed, to lower altitude, to the artistry of the last minute. In 1942, artistry could change a battle. In 1944, it only changed a paragraph. So the assumptions met the reality and lost. They lost because they put their faith in the closeness of combat when opponents had moved the terms outward, because they demanded too much from individual courage and too little from systems, because they wrote a poem on a day the other side ran a factory. The men who died inside that mismatch were not lesser. They were late. The wall makes lateness mortal. Trace a clean vector, call backward, and you arrive in places that smell of machine oil and paperwork rather than salt. The wall began where magnetrons were cast to a standard, where vacuum tubes were ruggedized to survive humidity and shock, where transformers ran cool because an engineer in a city the fleet would never see insisted on it. Quality control did not chase perfection. It hunted variability and killed it. Crates left factories with part numbers that matched drawings. Ships received them through convoys that learned to treat electronics as urgently as food. The miracle of late Pacific War is not that the Navy could fight across an ocean, it is that it could repair across an ocean. A carrier is a poor church without spare tubes. With them, the sweep keeps its vow every 4 seconds. Training translated hardware into habit. An operator learns to distrust the single sweep and to love coincidence, to hear a faint spike twice and turn belief into action. A controller learns a grammar of vectors and a rhetoric that refuses to clog a circuit with adrenaline. He practices until altitude bands and closure rates feel like bones in his hands. Schools teach men to speak the same phrase the same way, so a pilot from Indiana and a pilot from Maine can be steered by one language. Doctrine binds the parts into a loop that can endure boredom and panic both. Manuals look dull until you notice that every page lays another brick. Confirm detection. Keep the picture. Vector spare. Rotate before fatigue. Debrief without alibis. Redundancy is not romance, but it is mercy. Extra operators mean the two. AM watch hears a weak return, as fact rather than fantasy. Extra parts mean a sulking receiver can be swapped before a raid becomes a rumor lost to static. Extra pickets mean the wall's horizon moves outward in practice, not in speeches. Each surplus costs berths and stores and patience and buys minutes. Minutes are the currency the wall spends most freely. Supply chains turn miles into those minutes. A rail schedule, a convoy manifest, a winch on an island pier, a petty officer with a manifest, a technician with a talk value, a scope that lights, a plot that appears, a controller who stops whispering theory and starts speaking geometry. Failure becomes feedstock. Ducting paints phantoms and drags fighters off their posts. The critique writes a caution in doctrine about inversions and the flare they leave on a tail. A jammed elevator adds 5 minutes to a launch. The contingency is rewritten so that the stutter isolates one lane of the factory instead of the whole. A controller talks too much during a hard merge and blinds a section with his eagerness. The phrasebook is tightened and drills enforce the coding uncrea, tightening until it is muscle. Progress is disrespectful to ego and loyal to outcome. This is why "they had more" is an excuse that mistakes quantity for capability. More becomes victory only when it is coherent. The wall is coherence. Factories insisting on sameness. Schools insisting on shared language. Ships insisting that maintenance schedules are holy. Commanders insisting that boredom is not the enemy. On the morning a controller calmly calls a raid at 200 miles. You are hearing a nation that has manufactured attention, shipped it forward, trained it into men who will never be famous, and synchronized it with the rhythm of decks. The Japanese could assemble pieces of this in places and weeks. They could not make it permanent. Permanence is what turns a trick into doctrine, and doctrine into fate. In a better story, the day is won by a dazzling gambit. In this one, the day is won by paperwork that arrives on time and by hands that keep faith with procedures. A faint spike appears at the outer ring. An operator believes. A plotter draws. A controller vectors. Fighters climb. Escorts break. Stragglers fall. Directors box. Leakers die. None of it is glorious up close. All of it, assembled, is the shape of victory. The Americans did not just see farther. They began earlier, and when war rewards earliness, the side that treats time as something you can build will keep it, spend it, and then spend it again. Every system invites a countermove, and the Japanese tried most of the plausible ones. They lowered their approach until propwash seemed to comb the backs of waves, hoping the sea's clutter would turn the scopes into liars. They split altitude bands to stretch cap, sent decoy clusters to bait vectors, staggered departure times to force the defender into guesses, and tried to make radio silence itself into a weapon. No beacons, no chatter, just the pure intent of metal and fuel sent along a plotted line. At night, they traded formation pride for the plies over 27, anonymity of black air, trusting that the American eye would be one more sleepy thing at 2 a.m. They fancied feints that would swing escorts wide, and they imagined a last-minute dive through cloud that would turn geometry into chaos. Each idea had logic. None had endurance. Low-level ingress worked until pickets were made part of the same mind as the carriers. A destroyer 40 miles out turned sea clutter from a hiding place into a filter. Short-range sets flourished targets at angles the big air. Search radars were never meant to love. The trick of skimming in under the lobe of an antenna ends when the defender's network includes sensors whose job is to stare at the horizon like a wolf. 8 or 10 minutes of early warning earned by a picket with a good set and a better operator still buys a climb for the cap and a laying of guns that matters. What seems like a thin sliver of time on a clock becomes a staircase to altitude for men who have been practicing staircases for months. Splitting altitude to force the defenders to split their fighters seems shrewd until you remember that the American doctrine was built around reserve. A controller whose picture is firm can choose not to mirror the enemy's distribution. He can mass high, where energy will decide the story, and trust pickets and mid-level sections to bleed the rest. You cannot bait a man who refuses to be theatrical. The Japanese discovered this in the worst way by watching one band of their formation get mauled, while the other found itself arriving alone, intact but irrelevant, like a speech given after the audience has left. Decoy raiders scratched on scopes only until the voice on the net demanded growth across sweeps. A single heavy bloom that failed to migrate as a real raid would become a skunk with opinions, and controllers stopped gifting it vectors. When a decoy did move, the network asked for corroboration. A picket sighting, a height finder's confirm, triangulation that hardened into math rather than anxiety. In the handful of cases when decoys drew blood, it was not because the deception was brilliant, but because a circuit was tired and a controller had not yet earned permission in his own mind to disbelieve a single sweep. The American fix was not counter-deception. It was rest and drill. Fatigue is an opponent you defeat by schedule. Night should have favored the raider. In the old math, patrol lines vanish after sunset, and the idea of surprise sleeps naturally. Radar made night a neutral element that levied different taxes. Yes, inversions and ducting play tricks more often in darkness. Yes, watchstanders can hallucinate. Yes, the voice loses crispness when a body's core craves warmth. But the same pulse that sketched a raid in noon blue sky also sketched it at 0217. And the men who had trained to love coincidence stayed faithful to it in darkness. The Japanese night raider discovered that the first intercept was no longer a near-ship jolt out of the dark. It was a high, clean cut at ranges where his instincts felt blindfolded. The few nights when the wall failed exaggerated hope and punished the next attempt. The median night belonged to routine and to a crew that believed routine was a form of courage. Radio deception tried to mimic voice, cadence, even slang, an eerie ventriloquism that might have pulled an eager section wide if eagerness had been doctrine. It wasn't. The Americans standardized phraseology because standardization is a shield against charm. A counterfeit directive that did not rhyme with the book died in the headset not because the controller was sophisticated, but because he was boring by choice. He said only what procedure allowed, and so a deceiver who ornamented or elided revealed himself like a counterfeit note next to a bank teller with good fingers. Weather was the one ally that sometimes showed teeth for the attacker. Squalls painted suspicion, cloud bands swallowed, verification. Contrails betrayed a high section that wanted anonymity. A raid emerging from cloud close, could, on a bad day, be upon the inner ring before the controller felt honest. But weather is an equalizer with a taste for fairness. It hurts the raider as often as the defender. A formation that must burn extra fuel to wiggle through a ceiling arrives short and brittle. Escorts that break to maintain sight with their charges bleed energy and give the high cap the angles it wants. Weather helps most when it is a surprise. The wall's gift is to reduce the number of legitimate surprises. The Japanese tried to attack the factory, as well as the front. They mined lanes, killed pickets, and sought to mess with the deck cycles. A wounded destroyer leaves a gap in the network that shows up immediately on the board as a dead quadrant into which the controller must project more guesswork than he likes. A bulky elevator, a fouled deck, and suddenly launches come in a ragged rhythm, and the corridor the controller builds gets thin near the center. These were the worst days for the defender, and they looked like a normal sea day to anyone who did not understand how much the timing matters. Yet even here the counters to the counter counted. Picket stations were staggered with overlap, not butt-joined as if men believed steel never failed. Decks carried reserve rhythm, not just reserve planes. The command mind refused to believe that a complication should be allowed to become an excuse. The Japanese could create mess. The Americans could metabolize it. The boldest countermove was philosophical. Accept attrition as the price of burning a carrier. If enough planes could be gotten through, the defender's arithmetic would be revealed as cruelly conservative. A single bomb on the right deck on the right minute turns math into smoke. That logic is real and deadly, and Pacific history is scrawled with the names of ships that met grief despite the best loops their crews could maintain. But philosophy fights physics at poor odds. A raid that spends 40 minutes paying the toll of early intercepts and layered slashes arrives with fewer attackers and thinner formation and nerves like wire. Gun directors meet it having rehearsed for half an hour. The ship has been angled into wind or out of range as suits the admiral's sense. The bomb that gets through feels like fate. Most bombs do not. The wall does not promise invulnerability. It promises that the price of a hit will be so high and so rare that the factory can pay it without breaking. Every countermove makes the defender smarter if the defender is built to learn. The Japanese discovered that truth too late. The Americans discovered that the mean outcome, not the dramatic one, is what doctrine should be built around. When the list of enemy ideas has been exhausted and the intercepts still keep arriving 30 or 40 miles sooner than the attacker thinks respectable, the feeling in the cockpit shifts from resolve to a private suspicion that the air itself is collaborating. That suspicion is the real failure of the countermoves. They do not just break, they teach the attacker a lesson he cannot unlearn. The first thing that happens when you realize you've been seen early is a small betrayal in your gut. It does not announce itself as fear, because fear feels like a drop, like the elevator of your body falling 2 floors. This is different. It is recognition that the premises you flew out with, the ones that ordered your hands and leaned your head and calmed your breath, are obsolete before you can make new ones. You can be brave inside that recognition. Many were. But a brave man whose schedule has been taken from him is a man spending energy against geometry rather than toward an objective. American pilots felt the inverse. Early detection bred the most useful form of confidence: procedural calm. Confidence is not a jolt, it is a narrowing of variance. Launch because the picture justifies it. Climb to a known altitude band in a known number of minutes. Accept a vector that is corrected in fine increments rather than thrown like a spear. Arrive at the merge with energy on the plus side. Dives are choices, not flinches. The canopy world feels predictable. The controller's voice comes as reminders, not surprises. You still must be brave. You are simply allowed to pick the moments when bravery pays. Inside the raid, time changes color. The minutes meant to be spent committing, tidying formation, and descending into a run become minutes spent defending against fighters that keep arriving as if the sky had memorized you. The first intercept strips escorts from line abreast into a clatter of personal dogfights. The second intercept arrives before cohesion is restored, not because the Americans are greedy, but because their schedule is knitted to the raid's course. The third intercept is where fatigue enters thought, where the fuel gauges that were once theories turn into options you can count on one hand. You are forced downward by angle and instinct. You are greeted by pickets whose fire has been waiting with a level patience the human eye cannot afford. POW interrogations later are dry documents, but in certain sentences you can hear the maintenance noise of morale. Intercepted farther out than expected. Fighters present at altitude, unable to reform after first contact. Leakers taken under accurate fire. They are bureaucratic words for spiritual weather. Men do not mind being killed by opponents they can see and name. They resent being dissolved by a schedule. A pilot who believes the enemy has eyes beyond his own eyes feels not simply outmatched but outvoted. His courage can still save a crewman or finish a thought or put an honest bomb into a sea he knows is widening above a target he will never see. But the courage is being spent to preserve self-respect instead of to fulfill a plan. Do that enough times and the brain rewrites its expectations. Strike briefings lose the glaze of zeal and acquire the sound of paperwork. Faith drains out of optimism and accumulates in stubbornness. The Americans are not immune to morale's weather. A controller who sends a section to chase a phantom at 0300 learns the particular shame of wasting the coin of trust. A pilot who arrives 5,000 feet below the merge because his climb schedule assumed a wind that lied curses in a small, tight way that does not make it into reports. A ship that takes a bomb in the middle of a week of clean pictures and clean merges feels the sickly thought that luck might be the real thing after all. What keeps despair from flowering in a system built on probability is the system's own appetite for correction. An error is ritualized into lesson quickly enough that another error of the same shape is no longer possible. Faith, in such a world, is not belief that you will not be hurt. It is belief that pain will not breed nonsense. On the Japanese side, stress lives between doctrine and physics. The men who wrote the routes had pride in their plans and contempt for the idea that the enemy could see them as if from above. The men who flew into invisible detection learned otherwise, and carried that contradiction back into the planning room. A quiet war begins between the romance of execution and the humility of instruments, and because humility is an institutional habit rather than an individual one, it cannot win quickly. A nation can turn toward instruments only as fast as it can manufacture not just boxes but belief. By the time belief develops, factories have been bombed and training pipelines starved, and the wall's lesson arrives after the wall's victory. There is also the sanctity of surprise, a sacrament pilots carry like talismans. When it is taken from you, even in a fair fight, you feel cheated by the world itself. Surprise gives men stories. Radar steals stories and replaces them with ledgers. A good raid narrative ends with the shock of sight ship, wake, island, smoke, and then the hot precision of the run. An early intercept replaces that climax with a long prologue of attrition. It is hard to write about in a way that flatters the ego, and the ego must be fed if an institution is to ask boys to fly long miles for the chance at myth. The Americans did not need myth. They needed minutes. Their stories grew dull and victorious. The Japanese stories stayed bright and ended before the third act. If you want to understand why a doctrine collapses without theatrics, look at the posture of pilots before and after. Early in the war, shoulders are forward, a tilt in the neck that says the world can be taken. By 1944, the tilt has straightened. Men sit like accountants, told to find a surplus in a ledger that is already honest. They pre-flight, with a care that reads like resignation. They carry more fuel and fewer illusions. When they speak of the enemy, they speak of the wall, the word is not used. But the feeling is that thing which finds them somewhere between 200 and 100 miles, and goes on finding them until they are either dead or out of options. Bravery remains. Surprise dies. What dies with surprise is a tradition that advised men to trust the last mile more than the first. The Americans taught the opposite lesson, and learned to like the way it sounded. Early detection does not simply make one intercept neat and one deck cycle punctual. It triggers a chain whose links are all load-bearing. A raid, discovered at 200 miles, becomes a plan at 180, becomes altitude in the bank at 160, becomes the first slash at 90, becomes the second at 70, becomes fragments at 50, becomes gun directors that do not have to improvise at 30, becomes a carrier whose deck crew keeps its pulse at 15, becomes a battle that looks effortless in the retelling, becomes a campaign tempo that stays high because effort did not have to be paid back in repairs and funerals. The cascade is not poetry. It is logistics played forward. Start with cap. When a fleet knows early, cap can be layered without panic. Fuel is allocated with clairvoyance that comes from numbers rather than superstition. A section aloft is relieved on schedule. A reserve is launched before it becomes a necessity. The meat is engineered instead of prayed for. When the meat is engineered, the fighters' kill rates press upward, while loss rates press down. When loss rates press down, pilots accumulate experience rather than mythology. They pass that experience to younger men who do not have to carve their first lessons into their own skin. The average pilot grows steadily more exact. The next link is AAA. Directors that are not surprised have time to lay, to confirm fuses, to rehearse sectors, to rest one set of eyes while another stares. When the leakers arrive, they do so as single problems, not as a swarm that forces fratricide and waste. Ammunition is spent in ratio to result, not to anxiety. The same battery that would have flung shells on speculation in a late-discovered battle becomes a surgeon in an early warned one. That change in character preserves ammunition for the next day. It preserves crew for the next month. It preserves confidence for the longest war of all, the one against fatigue. Carriers are the engine of the engine. A deck that keeps its schedule becomes a factory that delivers predictables. Cap sections on time, strike groups launched and recovered without wrenching improvisation, maintenance done during the hours it was meant to be done instead of stolen from sleep. Engines are nursed to their next 100 hours rather than thrashed for the next 10. Pilots are briefed on real trends rather than forced into general speeches. Ordnance crews live inside the slow accumulation of mastery that comes from doing the same sequence in the same way until the body finds a set of movements that wastes nothing. All of that is boring to read and decisive to live. Ships survive. That is not merely an end in itself. It is a beginning. A carrier that is not hit today flies tomorrow. A cruiser that keeps her radar masts unbent tonight extends the network's horizon tomorrow. A picket destroyer that is not scuttled does not need to be replaced out of a pool that is always shallower than any admiral desires. Survival in this sense is a kind of compound interest. Each day you keep your machines and your people alive is another day in which they can be used to make survival more likely. Rare events, lucky bombs, unlucky fires still puncture the line. The line trends in one direction when the wall is real. The cascade continues inland in ways men at sea did not always feel. If raids are broken far out, strategic reach grows, because carriers can be risked where they could not have been risked before. If carriers can be risked, strikes multiply. If strikes multiply, enemy airfields and factories and training rhythms fray under attention. If enemy rhythms fray, the pool of pilots arriving at the front shrinks and the average hours per airman fall. The men you meet at 90 miles grow green. Green men die faster. They inflict less damage. They teach less to those behind them. The aggregate curve bends steeper. The invisible wall you built at sea begins to throw a shadow on shore. There is a moral cascade as well. One fewer charts capture. A service that learns to live by minutes grows a sense of justice that has nothing to do with slogans. Officers become patient with procedure and impatient with flair that costs time. Enlisted men know when a leader respects the perfect alignment of a rack and when he secretly wishes to be famous. The organization purges the worst of its gamblers because gamblers are expensive and the wall rewards accountants. That can sound bleak, as if joy were banished, but listen to the laughter on a deck that hit every launch on time, and you will hear the only joy that matters in a long war. Competence that prevents funerals. The cascade's last effect is not a battle won. It is a culture preserved from the corrosions of loss. The Japanese experienced their own cascade, metastasized into despair. Raids return lighter than they left, training hours shrink, veterans dwindle, engines that might have been treated gently are flogged because there is no next week in the mind, airfields that might have been rotated are held too long. Doctrine that might have adapted is defended as dogma because men seek pride where performance cannot supply it. When a wall removes surprise, men reach for myth. Myth spends courage wastefully. Courage is a currency. The factory always wants to see saved for moments that make math into victory. In the record, the cascade looks like a run of dates and a chart of sorties. On the water, it looks like steadiness. Radar did not end the war. It did something quieter. It allowed a fleet to apply itself at scale every day it floated, to file down the enemy's options until even brave men felt the sky itself leaning, to turn distance from a friend of offense into a servant of defense. The sum of those days is the difference between a campaign that hemorrhages strength and one that bleeds only when randomness demands its due. There is a moment, somewhere between 200 miles and 100, when the world of 1,939, the world of eyes and wagers and last-minute courage ends. It ends not with a new weapon that kills invisible novelty, but with a schedule that kills by refusing to be surprised. The Japanese never wrote that schedule into their plans. The Americans did, and the schedule became a wall that made the sky feel smaller for anyone who tried to cross it. After the Marianas, pilots did not speak about miles the way they had. They spoke about minutes. They spoke about when the first slash would land, when the second would arrive, how long a controller would hold them high before feeding them down like controlled fire. The language of the air changed because the air had been reorganized. It is easy now to turn technology into talisman and forget that boxes only hum when fed by culture. The eye that reached 200 miles was not a magic lens. It was the tip of an arm that began in factories and schools, in watchbills and manuals, in the quiet hardness of officers who cared more for procedures than for poetry. The Japanese could have built the boxes, and in places they did, but they could not, in 1944, build the ecosystem that let a faint echo ripple through a fleet and become geometry, and then dead men. The wall was not a secret. It was a discipline. Disciplines are not captured, they are grown. War favors those who arrive earlier in the decision loop. That sentence will outlive the names of the islands over which this particular theatre clenched its teeth. In the Philippine Sea, arriving early meant seeing at 200 miles and treating that sighting as the first actionable minute of a plan. In the decades since, the ranges and instruments have changed, but the logic has not. Whoever buys the first minutes cheaply spends the rest of the hour at a discount. Whoever mistakes bravado for punctuality spends dearly and wonders why the ledger will not balance. If the ocean is a stage, it is one where timing matters more than monologue. On the day that gave newspapers a nickname, surprise died of bureaucratic causes. That offends sensibilities trained on romance, but it should comfort anyone who prefers fewer funerals to better stories. The men in the CICs were not poets, they were stewards of minutes. The pilots who rolled inverted into the first slash were not duelists. They were executors of an arrangement the operators had made. The destroyer pickets were not bit players, they were the wall's forward bricks. The gun crews were not a separate cast, they were the last stanza of the same song. Together they turned 200 miles of ocean into American time. For the Japanese, the sky grew smaller and meaner. Smaller because their first honest look did not arrive above the target, but in an ambush they could not see. Meaner because the air sided with a schedule. Many of them flew well anyway. Many of them were brave anyway. Courage is not nullified by a wall. It is redistributed into moments that matter less. That is the grief of late war air. Watching men who deserve epics be reduced to arithmetic. It is also the stern mercy of systems that save other men by making the air unfair. If you stood on the island of a carrier at dusk and watched the hoses darken the deck and the tractors tow the last machine to its mark, you might think the day had been quiet. The wind would be moderate, the wake straight, the sky a postcard. Nothing in that scene would explain why the Japanese never knew American radar could track planes 200 miles away until the knowledge arrived as a hurt. But in the offices below, the grease pencil would be blackened down to a stump. In the controller's log, there would be times and angels, vectors and merges, written with a neatness that looks like detachment and is actually respect. In the engine shops, men would be counting hours on motors like monks counting beads. That is the appropriate final image. A fleet that looks composed because its attention has been disciplined. Technology changes, enemies change, the names of seas change. The wall remains wherever people decide that time is not a backdrop to courage, but the thing courage should be spent on purposefully. So let the epigram be simple and a little unkind to myth. They measured ranges in miles, we measured warning in minutes. They trained for the last 100 miles, we trained for the first 200. They believed the ocean was empty. We filled it with a schedule. The sky did not get smaller because the heavens were offended. It got smaller because a room without windows learned to turn faint echoes into decisions, and those decisions arrived early, and early was enough.